We have just been out canvassing in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have quite a few guests lined up for the stream today, starting with a couple of Zoomers. Apparently, we're going to talk about Zoomers and politics. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves? Do you want to say maybe your name, your age, and why your opinion is important?
Sure, my name is Dylan Burns, I'm 22, and why my opinion is important. I don't know if my opinion is particularly important, but I focus on foreign policy issues because obviously the future of Zoomer society is going to be based upon international markets, foreign policy, what wars we do get involved in, what wars we don't get involved in, and what the future geopolitical landscape is about. So I focus on stuff like that. Of course, I care about domestic issues as well. You okay there? You okay there?
He's dying from old age.
Oh yeah?
A good time to swallow your water.
You okay, Grandpa?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us who you are and why your opinion matters and how old you are?
Hi, I'm Pxie, as some of you might know. I'm 24, which would make me 2 years older than you. You're 22?
Yep, 22.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. I don't know if my opinion matters, but regardless of whether it matters or not, I want to try my best to help Democrats and progressives win these upcoming elections. I think there's a lot on the stake, and I really want to see more young people activated. So that's why I'm here. That's why we're all here.
So last I read, as a foreigner, Biden might very well have owed his last victory to the youth vote because they came out in unprecedented numbers. I think it was something like 57% of them voted. Mm-hmm. Seems to be the case that they're a bit less up for voting this time. Seems to be maybe barely 50% of them are willing to come out and vote for this next election. And that might cost Biden the presidency and get Trump back in. Why is that?
I think
Why should young people vote in this next election?
Well, there's two questions there. The first one is to why they're not turning out, or why the rates looks like they could possibly be lower than last time. I think the novelty of Trump as the enemy might have worn off for some people. The idea that, oh, he can be president, and if he's president for another 4 years, just like the 4 years we just had with the chaos with COVID and the chaos in foreign policy and the attacks on Roe v. Wade and the changing of the Supreme Court that led to that. I think that, with 4 years' time, any amount of time, people can start to be, either looking back with rose-tinted glasses or, it wasn't that bad. For example, if you poll people on George W. Bush after the fact, he actually has a net positive approval rating in the majority of the country. Why? Because after 20 years or so, people can start to wear down exactly why they voted against them. And after 3 years of the Biden administration, maybe some people are forgetting the crucial fact that things can always get worse. I also think that certain policy priorities which Biden said he was going to champion either got steamrolled and blocked by Republicans, or there hasn't been particularly a lot of attention directed towards it. For me, for example, I care a lot about a public option. It's gotten no attention this administration whatsoever, and I don't even know if that's because the Biden administration doesn't want to, but it's just not legislatively possible. A good example of something that could maybe have undercut support for a lot of people, for example, is the child tax credit. While that's not particularly important for young people, that ended because of Republican blocking, but it happened during the Biden administration, so people are just going to do the math. That was the Biden administration. That's when it got cut. Therefore, it's Biden's fault.
See, what I was thinking is that when you look at that data and that drop, these are people who did vote in 2020 but don't want to vote in 2024. So it seems to be that they were willing to vote to get Trump out.
Yes.
But the concept of keeping Trump out, now that he's out, seems to be a bit.
It's not a motivator for them to do it again.
Do young people just have an object permanence issue? Can they not understand the idea of voting someone out and keeping someone out is kind of quite similar?
I don't know if that's a young people thing. I think object permanence is a person issue. Because again, like I said, the polling data on Bush and the improvement of how people look at him when they look back, it's not because everyone's changed their opinion on the Iraq War, or everybody's changed their opinion on how he handled the economy or the housing crisis, or nobody's changed their opinions on these things. It's looking back, forgetting things over time. I think that's not a young people issue. I think that's just a people issue.
Yeah, I think when it basically came towards voting Biden versus Trump, I think a lot of people, or a lot of Gen Z, that was kind of their first coming to age, if that makes sense, when it came to voting and getting really politically active. I think they voted Biden in with not just to screw over Trump. I think that's absolutely it as well. But I think they had a lot of high hopes, and I think with things that happened with foreign and abroad, and also at home, especially with like Republican like blocking and like getting in the way of things. For example, like trying to pass student debt relief and then having that blocked by the Supreme Court and such. I think a lot of people just kind of lose hope and kind of get sad and kind of are like, well, what's the point if like everything's gonna stay the same? But everything won't stay the same, and everything can get worse, and it's hard to make people fully realize that when they're in the midst of disappointment. So I think it's up to our Democratic leaders and, you know, us basically to give people hope again.
See, I feel like that's a very pessimistic thing to sell to like a young person, right? To be like, yeah, things are, the promises that you felt were owed to you were not delivered, but it could be worse than this. I mean, do you feel like that's a fair assessment? Do you think that a lot was promised by the Democrats and it has actually fallen short? Or do you think people voting for the first time maybe had unrealistic expectations? Do you think it's both? Do you think people are rightfully angry at Biden for not delivering on student debt in the way that he promised? Or what?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think the one that's least charitable is the fact that a lot of people genuinely don't know how the system works. And for example, I've seen interviews with voters who are asked about Roe versus Wade getting overturned, and they're angry at Biden for it, even though it wasn't Biden who appointed the Supreme Court justice that overturned Roe versus Wade. It wasn't Biden who passed the law that made that happen. The judicial branch is separate from the chief executive. It's separate from the legislator. He couldn't really do anything once those Supreme Court justices were appointed outside of passing a law, which they didn't have the votes to do. So that is a situation where I think it's just ignorance, but I don't think that, you know, saying that is, I think it's not giving credit enough to voters or giving credit enough to young people. I think part of it is the fact that they were promised certain things, or at least they were told that these things would be fought for, like I said, with a public option. But under the majority that Biden had for 2 years, it was extremely slim. And then the second 2 years, it was with a Republican House majority, which has blocked everything, including massive immigration reform that would lean towards their policies. So if that type of compromise isn't even possible, it's kind of hard to imagine getting compromised on something like a public health care option, which was a big motivator for the Bernie Sanders movement, which was heavily, you know, supported by young people, including myself.
I mean, you can say it's ignorance, and maybe it is, but I feel like the answer to it is probably just not even that satisfactory, right? Because if you're talking about Roe v. Wade, then you can explain how that was a Republican thing. Or if you're talking about the issues with the Afghanistan pullout, and you can talk about how Trump actually kind of paved the way for that and just kind of kicked the can down the road so that someone else would have to bear the brunt of it. But then at that point, you're just getting into a conversation about like the three branches, or like, here's actually why this bad thing happened under Biden wasn't really his fault. But then you're also sending the same message that it's like, okay, well, so it's true that if we vote Democrats, then the bad thing will happen anyway.
Yeah, I think selling the idea of you elect this person, therefore then all the changes happen, that's dependent upon the president having supreme power, and it's also dependent upon which is in the situation. You have to have Congress, you have to have the Senate, and sometimes even the judicial branch can get in the way, which is what happened when we were talking about certain parliamentarian rules, and that was in Congress when he was trying to use budget reconciliation to pass a $15 minimum wage, which failed. And if you wanted to go around that person, you would have to convince people like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who were strong holdouts. And I think that that type of bureaucratic reality, gridlock, is something that is very crushing for young people who need their issues solved now. If you have student debt, I mean, you can sit on it if you want to wait 5, 10, 15 years. But these are issues that are affecting them on a day-by-day basis with high levels of debt, either healthcare debt or medical debt, not healthcare debt, medical debt or student debt. So if you're facing those issues now, saying that, well, maybe we'll be able to build up solution 10, 15 years down the line when you just got energized in the politics, that can be pretty soul-crushing for a lot of people. But some of the blame does have to fall at Biden for not championing certain issues, which he could have. For example, marijuana legalization is overwhelmingly popular in the United States. The majority of states in the United States have now passed legal marijuana in one form or another. It's a winning issue, but he still stands against it, saying there needs to be more research done.
Well,
and that's
hasn't he taken like action against what is it, or action actually for like trying to legalize marijuana? Not fully, but I think
he wants to move it. He wants to move it down from Schedule 1, and
yes.
he wants to make it. I think there was some federal stuff for people on federal land or federal property, partying people.
Yeah.
But there's been no open campaign statement from him that hey, we are in favor as the Democratic Party of legalization of marijuana on the federal level. And let me just throw something out there. When I came here to Ohio is a weed state. It's legal here. It just was made legal. Same in Maryland. If I wanted to get on the plane to take pot from Maryland to Ohio, I can't do that because we're going across state lines, and we're talking about, in some instances, federal property, federal law. And because of that, even though it's legal in both states, I cannot transport that from one state to another. And that can only be resolved by federal legislation. Stuff like that can only be changed through federal law, not by lowering schedule status. It has to be legalized on the federal level.
Yeah, I think on a similar note, when it comes to the whole idea of like what or how we can motivate young people to go out and vote, or to still be like pro-Biden, or still be at least pro like Democratic Party in general, I think what isn't highlighted enough are the instances where the Democratic Party like has fought, and maybe it has been blocked, but hey, yeah, they have tried fighting for it. Because I think people just look at the consequence and they don't look at what's going on in the interim. So I do think being like, hey, you know, we tried to pass the student loan debt. We're still in the process. We're still using a different argument to get to the Supreme Court, basically, to try to pass it. Like, this fight isn't over. I think that can help remind people that, hey, some things haven't been passed, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. Like, these things are continuously worked on.
Do you think it's effective because I noticed the Democrats don't really sing their own praises that often, even though they have done quite a lot that I've noticed. Like things that actually kind of, an example is like moving to reduce overdraft charges to stop them from being like these kind of extortionate fees and just actually making it more like a break-even policy. But then, do you feel that's effective of like trying to sell the things that they have actually achieved to people who don't feel like that much has changed?
Yeah, I think absolutely, because otherwise you just get stuck in like this negativity cycle and vortex, right? And it's like, you know, the news definitely, I think, feeds on negativity. It keeps people entertained, or it keeps people basically anxiety ridden, looking at it, constantly like waiting for the next bad thing to happen. So I think it is harder to just put these things out in the cycle. You see this in social media posts too. Like sometimes you get the, oh, loving post, yeah, he's so cute. But let's be honest, Twitter's cancer. Like we all know it is. And it is like that for a reason. Most social media is cancer for a reason. And it's because like our anxiety brain just like basically takes control of everything and just wants to keep consuming that content. So I think, yeah, being able to slap people a little bit awake and be like, hey, look at the good things.
Not physically.
Not physically. Not now. Can help a lot.
Wow.
I think the Democrats should champion their own achievements more. For example, we've just had the longest period of sub 4% unemployment since the 1960s, which is talked about as, when they say make America great again, that's the period that was true before COVID, that was true before Trump, that created the foundation for Trump to rise. Until those issues are dealt with, which we've been unable to due to legislative gridlock, and I do think on some issues like marijuana legalization, not enough courage. I think that, you know, that's going to be a problem to pitch it to people. But again, it needs to be sold that things can get worse, and the stability that we've had past Trump, I do think is important. People might not feel that when it comes to the vibes that are put on in the media. When we talk about economic stability, and when we talk about like stability of what the presidential policy is on these issues. Oh my gosh.
Well, yeah, when you said vibes there, that's the problem, is that you can have these like unemployment levels that we haven't seen since the 1960s and all these kind of things, but then the fact is that people still feel like there are economic issues. I mean, what's happening? Is this just like, is it really?
I think economic pressures like high levels of debt, medical debt, for example, which are still staying the same, which is why healthcare, back to Bernie Sanders today, is still like a top 3 issue for voters.
Are you sure it's not just like a bunch of like social media, instant gratification Zoomers ordering too much DoorDash, running out of money, and thinking there's a recession? Because the amount of people I see who order DoorDash like more than once a week, or like, and then they wonder why they're scared. What's going on there?
I think some people got into bad habits during COVID, but I don't think that's the primary motivator. I really don't. I think that a lot of people were very helpful, particularly in the fallout of the Bernie movement, with a lot of big demands and big policy pushes on the national stage on issues that we had never heard about before, like Medicare for all, or systems of healthcare that we thought was almost like a far-off pipe dream, and still is a far-off pipe dream, at least for the time being. But when you're energized that way, and you're pushed that way, and you go out and you give it your all, and then you get crushed, and you get maybe 1/10 of what you wanted, or 2/10 of what you wanted, that might not be enough for some people to go out into the polls, which is why, again, the question needs to be put forward. Can it get worse? And it absolutely can.
I think young politically active people, you guys both took like pretty different paths,
Yeah, I
pretty
wanna know what
exceptional paths
Dylan-
actually. You went to the front lines in Ukraine
Yeah.
to take pictures,
Yeah.
and you are an organizer for, what's your job description for Operation Victory?
I basically work streamer operations and progressive
Streamer
victory.
operations, yeah.
Yeah, I go around finding the other streamers and basically, you know, helping manage and discuss future issues and what we should do to tackle those problems that arise. I want to know what started your political journey, Dylan. Like, what was the first time you became
Politics generally?
Yeah, how did you become politically aware, basically?
Well, when I was growing up, I was born to a mom who was heroin addicted, and she was using while she was pregnant with me.
Yeah.
I got very lucky. That thankfully had no effect on my development. I was very lucky. But that followed her for the rest of her life until she went into the grave. And during that process, I saw the difficulties that she had with getting health care and how around election season she would get scared that her healthcare options would be targeted. I remember one of the last conversations I had with her was after Trump got elected, her being fearful that her healthcare options were going to get targeted because she had to rely on publicly funded healthcare.
Yeah.
I listened to stories of disrespect as she was a homeless resident in D.C. of people as she falls, her body was slowly crippling, being unable to, when she fall on the ground, people just not even bothering to help her up. And that really angered me, and I was a very angry young man, and I wanted to find some outlet to vent my anger, and politics was that outlet. I thought instead of, I don't know, joining a gang or something, I'd rather help try to make it better so somebody else doesn't have to deal with that.
What about you, Loner? How did you get politically active? What was your political awakening?
It was an autistic special interest when I was 18 that never went away.
You just stuck
But I
with you.
mean, like, I had a pretty varied background. Spent a few years living in Dubai, going to private schools, not the top ones, but you had to go to private school in Dubai.
Yeah.
But then also to living in some of the poorest communities in Scotland, where there was a lot of crime, a lot of teenage pregnancies, a lot of it was pretty rough. A lot of racism because of me being Middle Eastern, and then learning quite early on, the difference that which political parties in power can actually make for you. Because with me growing up in that community, the way that we got out was because my single mum at the time had managed to get just enough money to move us into an area that could get us to a better school rather than being in one of the worst ones in the country. And the only way she could afford that was the difference that was made to her by child tax credits, which came from the Labour Party, which the Conservatives didn't want to do. So that was an example of how a very much lesser of two evils party, like Tony Blair's Labour Party, who went to Iraq, right, being able to actually make that difference just with one policy. And that actually, so seeing that impact and knowing where that comes from, and how that affected my life, I'm you notice it.
I mean, the child tax credit reduced childhood poverty in the United States by 50% in the short period that was introduced. Obviously, once it was unable to be renewed, and the Republicans blocked it from being renewed
Twice,
and then it was taken back, that reduction in childhood poverty was greatly smashed. It greatly slashed it. It reduced it a lot. But it just shows that who is in Congress. If we just had 4 or 5 more seats in Congress, we probably would have been able to renew the child tax credit, which was supposed to be the starting point to addressing childhood poverty.
And I think when you're a child as well, the effects of inequality and lacking just a few basic things is so massive on your growth and development. Because I even noticed that when I was a bit older, I started to work in schools of deprived areas, where we would go in and teach music to kids who were falling behind. And seeing that, of just spending an hour a week with these kids, showing them just how to play a couple of chords on the guitar, on the keyboard, or drums, or something like that, and noticing that the amount of confidence they gained from doing that just in an hour a week was huge.
Yeah.
Some people who were just afraid to talk or to anyone were suddenly going around the room and making friends and things like that, and some even being cheeky with the teachers in a positive way. So it's a pretty big difference. But then you also notice that regardless of how much that offered them, at the end of the day, for some of them, they would learn something, then they'd go back home, write to an abusive parent or an angry dad or mum, and then they're suddenly back in the exact same environment that made them unable to learn or keep that thing up in the first place. So knowing that that one thing can make a big change, but then there's all these other things that can just set you right back just within the,
Another, I think that's interesting because earlier today when I was canvassing, one of the doors that we knocked was a woman who was a mother, and she was talking about how she felt like the cost of living continuously goes up, but the minimum wage stays the same. And I think something that's important to know is that at least under the Biden administration, there's been stronger unions, basically. There's been a lot of pro-union policy, and the reason why I bring it to that is because we have a party in the United States currently trying to help labor rights. You know, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but it is like fundamentally important so that people get paid better, so that they have better jobs, and so that those people can go back to their families and have proper time with their children and be able to love and support them, which is, you know, a difficult task to do if you have to work like 12 hours just so you can get food on the table, you know?
When I was working in the DC, I worked shortly. I was interning. I was learning the ropes at a healthcare workers union in the DC area, SEIU 1199. And this was during the late Trump administration, during the Trump admin. The NLRB during the Trump admin was absolutely god-awful. It did everything it could to do nothing. And that means when the unions needed help with policy with violations of either the rules and regulations that guide these companies, what they can do with their workers, how they're supposed to negotiate with their workers, how they're able to take a contract and to deal with the union so they have better working conditions. Whatever it was done on behalf of the workers, the NLRB under the Trump administration did basically next to nothing. And I got constant complaints from union members about that while I was interning. When the Biden NLRB came in, one of the strongest points that most progressives that I talk to, even the most left-leaning progressives that I talk to, will admit is the Biden NLRB is the type of NLRB we need to rebuild a pro-union movement in this country. And in states like Ohio, that was built on union power, that's the type of messaging that could really, I think, do well here as people remember a time in their lives where they had more job security.
Well, are we getting joined? Okay.
Oh.
What was your political journey, Pxie? How did you?
Oh, okay. Okay. So basically, you know, I was born and raised in, and growing up, I saw a lot of poverty, like a lot of it. And I remember from a very young age, just like kind of my mind exploding because we had to do community service. And, you know, in Puerto Rico, if you can go to a private school, you also go to a private school. So I did community service. I went to this like school that was a public school. I saw the paint falling off the walls. I saw the tables breaking down, the books all breaking down. And I remember thinking, like, what's the difference between me and these kids? What is the difference? Like, why do I get a nice school, a nice books, a nice whatever, and these kids don't? And when I realized it was luck from that young age, it just filled me with like a deep sense of injustice. This is not right. It should not be this way. And I think ever since then, I've had a passion for just wanting to make things right, wanting to get people the resources that they need and should have, and not be screwed over just because they got unlucky, ultimately.
On the topic of Puerto Rico, should they be a state? Oh, we have a new guest, by the way. We have, what's your name again?
You can call me Destiny.
Destiny.
Dustin.
Dustin.
Yeah.
I can't call a fully grown man Destiny. Dustin's fine. But welcome to the show.
LonerBox?
Yeah. Anyway, Puerto Rico, should they be a state?
Yeah.
Okay. Dylan?
No,
Why?
because I don't like them.
You don't like the Puerto Ricans? You don't like the Ricans?
No,
So you don't like
because all
me?
their boxers beat my favorite boxers, so I don't think they should be a state.
Well, maybe you should get better boxers.
That's true. We should get better boxers.
Yeah.
But no, they should be a state.
Right.
You have.
Want to confront Stephen on punching left?
Punching
Well,
left.
Yeah.
Pondering Politics wanted to do that.
He did, yeah.
But he
But I know
he
Loner
dipped.
wanted to jump in on that.
He won't do it while he's sitting next to me.
Why
For
do you
a good
hate
reason.
leftists? Why, okay, here's the. Okay.
Because they're cringe.
Why?
The Puerto Rico stuff is
They're-
a matter of just like having stronger institutional power, right?
Yeah,
Like
no,
you get more representation in Congress
Of
for
course, I mean,
Democrats.
it's a question of like no taxation without representation. It's a
well, fuck
basic
that. Well,
American
hold on. If
concept.
they were voting Republican, I wouldn't want to be a state.
If they were voting Republican, I'd still want them to be
That's
a
a
state.
U.S. territory, okay? They don't deserve representation.
You have more
have-
nuanced opinions on this, don't you?
Yeah, okay, whenever people ask me this question, to me it's the equivalent of like, hey, what if we had a child and like we beat it up every single day and then at 18 years old, we're like, hey, you either can be homeless Or you can get like a seat at the dinner table, but we still might beat you up. And it's like the first thing that has to happen is that we have to stop beating the freaking child, okay? Like we have to like be able to put them in a level of stability where they can actually make decisions that, you know, I guess are fully informed and realized before you do anything else.
Wait, what is the metaphor? How does America beat the child of Puerto Rico?
So basically, if you look at like Puerto Rican history as well as like current like Puerto Rican status and how we're under federal law, and basically like, you know, we can pass our own like general laws, but ultimately federal law like trumps all. It seems very hard for Puerto Rico to be able to like develop economically. Like our domestic economy is basically like shut down.
Yeah, but what does that have to do with federal law? I mean, federal law trumps state law in the United States as well, right?
Do you
Like, how does that?
let me be more specific. Do you know the Jones Act?
I've heard of it.
Okay, so let's say I have a shipment of cars
Explain for the people at home that haven't heard of that.
Okay, so let's say for whatever reason you have a shipment of cars from Brazil, right? Logically, if you're gonna like ship it, it would make sense for it to stop in Puerto Rico and then go to Florida. But the Jones Act basically dictates that no, you cannot do that. It has to go, maybe stop in Puerto Rico, go to Florida, then you have to change everything to a ship that was built in the United States with an all US crew, and then ship those cars back to Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico, because of, and I could go into this for a very long time because their long history of like US interference or domestic policy, blah, 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 basically ships most stuff. So who covers all of that? Who covers the grand cost of this? Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico.
Wait, why is that the policy?
Because that's U.S. federal law.
No, I know it's U.S. federal law. What's the point of that?
Oh, the point of that was it's supposed to help U.S. ships, basically, and U.S. like trade.
Merchant Marines.
What is
Merchant
is the Jones Act just Puerto Rico can't ship stuff directly to it, or is there like, is that a more comprehensive or like larger thing?
That's basically the biggest part of it. I think there's like 2 more clauses to it, but that's, and it's not just Puerto Rico that suffers from this. That's also Alaska and Hawaii. So that's overall the Jones Act. Or,
Wait, so you can't ship anything to Hawaii internationally either?
not if it's like for trading. If it's not like big shipments or anything. I'm sure if you want to do like FedEx something to Hawaii, but if you're like trying to sell in bulk or whatever. I know that was like very messy wording, but yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, LonerBox, fight with Dylan real quick on that.
What?
How do you fight about that?
The fight with me.
On what? What am I fighting you on?
You know exactly what.
Why would you do that last night? It was so rude.
Because they deserved it.
They deserved
The
it.
entire community. I never liked them.
Of course.
Do you think DC should be a state?
I do.
No taxation,
I do. The
taxation.
two options, right? The one option is they get either absorbed by Maryland because it would be Maryland because it's the best state, and then we just add a few Congress people, or we create them as a state. If you talk to DC people, they want to be a state. They don't want to be part of Maryland. They don't want to be part of Virginia. They don't want to stay in this weird middle ground where they do technically have representatives, but they're not voting representatives, so they just kind of stand there and wave. They want to be able to have an impact on the legislature, and they have a higher population than many Midwestern states.
Wait, can I cut in for a second? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I have a random question I want to ask, starting with Steven and then going around. What do you think should be people's most pressing issue? Not what it currently is, but what do you think is a cause that people should really focus more and care about more in the United States that they don't do right now?
Rule of law and democracy.
You don't think people care about democracy here enough?
No.
Do you think that because of the Trumpsters, or do you think like...
I think nobody does. I think when leftists talk about packing the courts, I think when Trump people talk about not having insurrections or having justified insurrections, yeah, I think it's all redonkulous. I think people have a really hard time when other people they don't like win, and they try to like institutionally make that impossible. And I think in some ways it's really bad. In other ways I'm more sympathetic, but...
Yeah. I guess I just want to push back a little bit because I'm not saying this is right or agree, but the argument that I've heard some people say about packing the courts is because they believe the courts are currently undemocratic or one of the most undemocratic institutions. And basically it was because of congressional, like, I think filibustering is the right word, I don't know, but that basically Trump got, I think, 1 or 2 more nominees onto the court than he was supposed to.
One more, probably.
They blocked Merrick Garland.
Yeah, they blocked Merrick Garland.
But I don't know if I would say that was necessarily undemocratic. It gets a little bit complicated. I mean, the Supreme Court is democratic in that the appointees come from the elected president, and the Merrick Garland block was kind of democratic in that the Senate sort of had a mandate from the people to be undemocratic by blocking that appointment. It's kind of complicated. I think that reforms to the Supreme Court are okay. I really like the idea of was it every 20 years or something, or 24 years or something, you force a Supreme Court justice to retire?
Yeah,
Basically what it does is it made it so that every single president would get the exact same amount of Supreme Court picks because you're rotating basically the retirements. It's not like a lifetime appointed thing. But regardless, I think you can argue there's an issue with the structure of the Supreme Court, or at least like the unfairness of the appointments. But to say that the solution to that then is to just add like 30 more justices is kind of silly.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about you, Loner?
By the way, I do just want to throw out there, FDR had like a majority, and he wasn't able to pack the courts in the fallout of the Great Depression. So not only is there a question about whether or not it's the right move, there's also a question about just the practicality of achieving something like that.
Yeah, that's valid.
What I think the most important issue for Americans should be.
Yeah.
I feel like inequality is quite a big thing here. It seems to be the case that the more equal and especially the more opportunity there is in society, a lot of other social problems tend to come down with it. At least I've heard some research on that. So, because when I come to America, the inequality seems pretty insane. Like, especially going on, one time I went from Georgia to New York on a megabus, what's it called? A Greyhound, not a megabus, that's the British one. And seeing just the disparity between all these different communities, and like you go through one town and like half the houses are derelict and they're falling apart, and then the other one you got this really nice urban center. Yeah, I don't know, I think that's always been a big problem. Probably very difficult to solve in such a big country, but I think that, and I do think the threats to democracy are quite real.
Cool.
Because when you have a democracy where like half the people don't believe in it, yeah, it's pretty scary.
I mean, I'm a foreign policy guy. I think foreign policy is a big issue, and I think Americans generally don't pay attention that much to foreign policy, considering how much outsized influence the United States has in the world, how much influence we have in the Middle East, how much influence we have in Europe, how much influence we have in Africa, all over the world, and in South America. I mean, a great example of this is, if you look at the New York Times this morning, the top 3 articles are about Joe Biden's age, and then the 4th is about Donald Trump saying the Russians should do whatever the hell they want in reference to NATO, and if they don't pay enough, then just screw them. That is a massive, horrible break with American deterrent policy in Europe. And that is something which could legitimately provoke a war. If the Russians misread that, if Trump is just trying to finagle a few more dollars out of NATO, but the Russians see uncertainty about our strategic position, about what our incentives are in Europe, and they think they can probe against the Estonians, they think they can probe against the Latvians, they think they can probe against the Lithuanians or any of these countries, then there's a situation where we have a real security crisis if the Russians try something like that, not because we've changed our actual military capacity to defend Europe or because we're just weaker now, but just because of uncertainty created by somebody who couldn't shut his mouth.
Do you think Americans should care more about other countries?
I do think Americans should care more about other countries.
I think it's a tall order, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a tall order, but it's the right thing to do, and it makes sense for us. For example, people talk about Europe and, who cares about the European?
It's like half of your trade,
Why
isn't
should we
it? Yeah.
care? The majority of our exports, our number one exports, go to Europe. They're our number one continent for exports. 45% of global GDP is concentrated within Europe and North America. They're a gigantic trading partner. We're intertwined with them geopolitically. If they were to go down, if there was to be an economic crisis in Europe, maybe they wouldn't be able to buy up all the LNG exports that we're sending over there. That would have an effect on our economy too, just like the housing market screwed over the Chinese as well in 2008.
Do you think isolationism is like a big growing? Do you think it's actually becoming the case that it's going to become a really serious threat?
It's a cancer, but it's always been here. It's just we've been able to kind of temper it down. If you look at the lead up to our involvement in the Second World War, there was a lot of America First sentiment. And I mean literally America First sentiment. That's what they called it. And there was a lot of isolationism during that period because they saw the horrors of the First World War, and their response wasn't, okay, let's limit what type of conflicts we go into and let's be smarter about entering these conflicts and know what interests we have at stake. It's let's just retract. It's an easy answer. It's a simple solution. Oh, getting involved in the world might be complicated. It might come with issues. There might be mistakes that we make on the international stage. So let's just retract from the international stage and pretend we don't have any interest anywhere else, which will just lead to, I mean, economic and geopolitical catastrophe.
It does seem like after World War II that changed pretty dramatically, right? Because since then you've got containment policies, a really big thing, and then I'm pretty sure the Vietnam War initially was quite popular, wasn't it? At least until.
It's complicated because it's kind of like a gradual increase. Like it was like a police action that became kind of a war, but we never technically called it a war. So I think it was more popular during the start, and of course decreased quickly as the war went on. But a bigger point I'm trying to make is not necessarily that the American government isn't interested in foreign policy. I think right now what we're seeing in the House with the decision atrophy in reaction to aid to Ukraine is an example of it leaking into our legislature. But my main concern is having American people, a citizenry, who are well informed enough about foreign policy, so when they hear somebody say, screw Europe, they can reflexively be like, that is insane, I need to stay away from that guy, that is stupid, I can't believe he would say something like that. That would danger our economy in the future of us possibly getting dragged into a global war by creating that uncertainty. I want people to vote for legislators based upon the knowledge that they will have a stable future for us on the geopolitical scene.
I think, I don't know if this is the right phrase for it. I think that there is something going on in America. Basically, simplification is very seductive in a way. Being able to say, oh, yeah, screw Europe. But why do we have to care about Ukraine? Why do we, I think people are maybe naturally even intuitively inclined towards that. And we see this in local domestic policy issues too. Or I guess this is also kind of international. Build a wall, lock her up. Just simple phrases, I think, really make people inclined to them. So I guess my question to you guys is how do we fight against, I don't say human nature, but this human inclinivity, I can't pronounce that word.
Inclination?
Inclination, yes. To want to simplify things to such an extent that we suddenly lose the nuances that are really important for policy making and basically policy building. I don't know if there's an answer.
It's a question about marketing. It's trying to find simple explanations for extremely complex problems, and sometimes those just don't exist. And on some issues, if you're a scam artist or a con man and you're willing to put on a better show with more lights and bells and whistles, you will have an advantage from a market standpoint, from marketability, to somebody who is an expert who knows what they're talking about, but they're going to have to give you a somewhat unsatisfactory answer because not everything has a super 100% satisfactory solution. And so the question is, in my opinion, what I like to do is just attempt to the best of your ability to embarrass those con men, to show them to be con men, to expose them as con men, and prop up experts who know what they're talking about.
So you don't think there should be a progressive, almost populist response, the progressives should come up with their ridiculous three-word cat sound bites and shit like that?
If I read a complicated Thomas Schelling book, some IR book that talks about all these theories and stuff, if I can simplify these theories to a chess game or to a checker game, as he has done in his books, that's great. But some situations are just not going to be possible for that, and I think I'd rather accept that and try to explain the situation and show the other people to be con artists, then degrade myself and misrepresent something like IR, which could then have negative effects down the line. If I misrepresent a certain defense policy, if I misrepresent nuclear brinksmanship to people in order to try to explain the type of risk-taking behavior and the percentages of risk that nation states are willing to put themselves under in these situations, then that could lead to real problems down the line where they're making incorrect decisions about something that really determines the future of everyone.
What do you think, Destiny?
I think a lot of things. Getting people to care about foreign policy, it probably starts with not being so divided at home. I think that when we're at each other's throats and we can't even agree on what basic reality is domestically, I don't know how we're supposed to think about reality internationally. Half the people in this country still probably think there were, massive amounts of Nazis and bioweapons labs in Ukraine, and that Azov is running the whole country, and there was a CIA planned coup in 2014 for Euromaidan. So yeah, I mean, as long as we have such huge stark contrasts at home with how we view the world factually, I don't see how we ever come together on a foreign policy thing.
When you said something about how the left don't care that much about democracy, I think because when I say that about Republicans and their complacency about what Trump does and how much they're willing to sacrifice in terms of democratic values to get their way, I can totally see how progressives would do that to the same degree if they had the chance to. Because I noticed when the Queen died in the UK, the debates that followed that were very much left-wing people saying she could have done more with her power, right? And then you just ask a few questions and you can basically get them quite easily into a position of admitting that they would basically be okay with a dictatorship, right? Would you be okay if the Queen did this policy arbitrarily? Yeah. What about this one? What about this one? And then suddenly you've just got someone accepting a dictator. But how would you compare those threats in the US, Republicans and left-wingers for being threats to democracy in the US?
I feel like we need to spend more time appreciating the system that we have. The system that we have, rather than the different like political ideologies that are fighting for power in the state. Because I think right now, people have basically completely and totally neglected the system. Like, they don't know how it works. They have no appreciation for it. And instead, it's just what tools can we use to enact whatever policy we want. Kind of like you said, I think that people would act like being an authoritative dictator was a bad thing, but if they're passing the policies that you want, I think people would largely be okay with that, which is a little bit frustrating.
What do you think is the biggest like misconception with how the U.S. government works? Like, what do you think is the one that people just don't get, don't understand, guess wrong, whatever?
Our institutions are largely effective. They're largely a reflection of the people right now who are historically divided amongst themselves, and I think that's why there's a lot of gridlock and a lot of stuff that doesn't seem to be working that well. But yeah.
I think 3 branches. The amount of times I've had to hear Americans blame Biden for Roe v. Wade is just insane. I can't, yeah. Progressive commentators would use that. Or saying that like Obama could have codified Roe v. Wade, even though I don't think he ever had that supermajority to do it. So, yeah.
I mean, I'm going to say foreign policy again. Foreign aid, Americans have a really perplexing view of foreign aid. Polling regularly shows that Americans believe that we spend between 20 to 25% of our budget on foreign aid. That's bizarre. It's almost delirious. It's around 1%. And so if we stopped scapegoating foreign aid for all of our economic woes, I think that would be nice.
Do you want to talk about punching left?
Whatever you want.
So this was Josiah's topic, but I was going to ask you, do you think when you have your fights like between left and right online, do you feel like you're doing it proportionately to the like political threat or power that they have, or do you have like other incentives in your head, or like other?
I mean, it
reasons
depends
for doing
on
it?
what issues are popular at the time. It depends on who's existing in my particular sphere, and it depends on what we're in particular focusing on.
That's what I feel like I struggle with, is because when I used to watch you fight with leftists for the last like few years, I never really understood like the disproportionality of it, especially because of your leanings like politically, or definitely more left than right. But then I noticed myself, for some reason, there's just something so much more tempting about going after like far left extremism than right wing. But I wonder if that's because it's people that you hold to a higher standard, or if it's just because it's like it feels worse when critique comes from your own side.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of two things. I think one is that they're just in your area more. Like, it would be weird if you went to the Republican National Convention or something and you took out your phone and you were fighting, with far left people or something, when you have so many Republicans around you to fight with, And then two, I think that because you are supposedly aligned more on core values, the differentiation in applied values is a lot more irritating. If you're like if you're a 15 an hour far left person, and you're sitting next to a Republican who doesn't believe in minimum wage, and it's like, okay, well, you're dumb. But if you're sitting next to somebody that purportedly shares your values, they're center left or whatever, or another far left person, and they don't want a 15-hour minimum wage, well, now there's like a huge problem. Like, the Republican's not supposed to agree with you. The Republican's not supposed to support minimum wage. It's not part of their values. But another left-leaning person like you should be. So something is really wrong with them or really wrong with you. And that's, I think, where a lot of the fighting comes from.
I always feel like when it comes to being in that specific area as well, because when far left people, they don't really I don't think they have really any power in like national politics, at least here in America. But it's one of the last countries on earth you're going to see like a socialist or communist revolution. But in social media, like in our space, they seem to have quite a lot of power, or at least a lot of influence. But at the end of the day, these are mostly people who are probably not going to vote, or if they do vote, they'll probably just vote Democrat.
Yeah,
So.
I was going to say their influence is definitely overblown. I feel like a lot of people just rather be keyboard warriors and go outside and actually like canvass and try to get people to vote. And
Whereas Republicans online, even though they're maybe harder to find or to get immediate access to, at least for me, they do vote, and they do want to like maybe march on the Capitol again with a bit more practice this time.
Outside of like the burnt out hippie movement and those types of like older type of far leftists, there are more far leftists among very young people, but there's a few problems. The first problem is those people don't really turn out to vote at the same rates of much older people who are not far left at all. And so even if at a higher percentage on average, they are on the far left, if you, number one, reject electoral politics, then you're not going to turn out. And so that's going to be a problem. You're not able to use that tool in your toolbox. And number two, just young people don't turn out generally. So I think that both of those things also further stunt the far left's ability to influence at least electoral politics directly. They do other things like direct action. I don't know how particularly effective that has been in the last few years, though.
I always feel like, I don't know if you two get this, I feel like it's so much harder to pull over or to like get changed minds from far left people, because at the end of the day, you're just really like a less, from where they're starting, you're just a less ideologically pure version of what they are. Whereas with right-wingers, I feel like there's much more opportunity that you're actually exposing them to arguments that they maybe just haven't heard before. I don't know.
I strongly disagree. I feel like with a lot of right-wingers that I talk to, like I think a lot of them are just operating on a completely different basis of just like factual, a different basis of reality, or even like such a different base of morality. And even if you can introduce them to new arguments, I think a lot of them have incorporated, and this happens with the left too, but basically people incorporate these parties into their identity, and I think they're scared to change their identity. So then, like, it doesn't matter what you say. They've defined themselves as a Trumper, as a pro-MAGA, America first. So I think there's like a deeper psychological issue going on here that you have to like have these people either expand their social network, their communities, get in touch, like having friends on literally a different side. Otherwise, just giving them these arguments, I don't think is enough to make them change their identification.
Yeah, but I just for personal experience of just like because I'm guessing once you do enough arguments, you get a bunch of like emails or DMs being like, "Oh, you changed, but I'm from this political alignment, and I used to believe this, but you've changed my mind on this, or you've made me consider this differently." I feel like getting that from like center-right people or maybe right-wing people is much easier than getting it from far-left people. I don't know, is that the same with you or you?
I've had a lot more center-right people, sometimes libertarians, because I do go to libertarian conventions, come up to me and say, "Okay, you changed my mind about this foreign policy issue, or maybe we should send everyone we do that." But I don't really convince many far-left people. I think, though, probably at a higher rate than you guys, because I hang out, or at least I talk to people, and I'm willing to fight them on this a lot more.
I think you're right, but for a hidden reason. I think it depends on the type of content you engage with and who you argue with and which fan bases you're interacting with. They give you an ability to kind of persuade people. So when I was debating a lot of far left people, I actually got quite a few emails from people saying like, "Hey, like I used to be a big Hassan fan. I used to be a big Russian." Some people here say it like, "Oh yeah, I was falling into the really far left, like communist, whatever bullshit, and now I'm not anymore." And when I was fighting a lot of red pillars or a lot of far right people, I would get just the opposite. When I'm like going on my rounds like debating Nazis, I'm not getting far left people being like, "Hey, thank you so much. I was about to become a full-on socialist." I'm getting people on the right. So I think that you do have a higher chance right now on the internet of convincing people on the right than convincing people on the left. But it's not because people on the right are more easily convinced. I don't know if that's true. I'm not even sure. That's probably not true. But it's probably just more because those are the only people willing to fight with you. Like it's pretty hard for me to turn Hassan or Vosh fans when they will never talk to me, which is like a good strategy on their part, because if they did, they would lose fans.
But I'm guessing like some of your React videos get more views than the Hassan or Vosh videos themselves.
Yeah, but that's not Hassan and Vosh fans coming to watch my videos. Those are other people that like to dunk on the lol cows and watch me farm the nice milk from both of them into my buckets.
So that's what,
Yeah.
So when you do that, it's not really with the mission of trying to bring far left people into a more sensible.
Honestly, God, I'm just trying to afford my child
entertainment.
support.
Yeah. Okay. I thought that. I just wanted to know. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
No, but I mean, truly, like the audiences that you'll convert are going to be reflective on who you're fighting with. I think at any given point in time. If I were to go on a tear. Like right now, so like for Israel-Palestine is a thing I'm debating a lot. I'm getting a decent chunk of pro-Palestinian people that are saying certain things like, "Oh, I was like really, anti-genocide and I'm pro-genocide of all the Palestinians, stuff like that." All the very far left people. But when I have, I've had one or two arguments, I think, with Israeli people, and I've gotten a couple people, I think literally a couple, I think just two, that have emailed me and they're like, "Hey, I never really thought about like the settlement stuff as much before," or like, "Hey, I can kind of see like how if you're a Palestinian and you've lived in, essentially apartheid conditions for 60 years, how maybe it could play into a horrible feeling of being trapped somewhere."
Yeah, but that's what I worry about, is because as far as the pro-Hamas left go and all that, again, I don't know exactly how much influence they have, but as far as like the pro-settlement or like hardline Zion, I think they do actually have a lot of influence. And there's the whole thing now about how it's like X number of Israelis would be okay with settling back in Gaza, like moving settlements back in. And it's not a majority, but it doesn't have to be a majority. It just has to be enough that they would do it, and there needs to be the right government in place to not stop them. which I think is.
Or to encourage them.
I think that's quite possible, yeah. I think like if they started setting up camp within a few months, would Netanyahu's government really stop them or try to like evict them? Probably, maybe
Come
not.
down to international pressure.
And that's quite. So I feel like again, as far as like tangible threats, like the very extreme right pro-Israeli side, I think is really, really dangerous right now. But at least in my own personal space, I feel like I have to go out and actively seek that. Whereas finding pro-Hamas leftists, like they just appear everywhere. They're just like, there's the first thing in my feed on Reddit and Discord and Twitter. They're the first ones in my chat asking for debates. And as far as finding like a right-wing like Israeli to argue with, I actually have to go and seek it out. Do you feel like you have the same issue, or do you just feel like you're just more aligned with Israel and that's why you end up there?
No, I mean, it just comes down to who's available to debate. I would love to debate that traveling. Is his name Traveling Israeli? I always say
Traveling Israel, yeah.
Oh yeah, that guy.
But he doesn't want to debate, yeah.
He doesn't?
No.
Why?
No. Probably because things like the settlements are completely and totally indefensible, or Israel's like really aggression, expansion, whenever they have the opportunity to do so, and any far-right Zionist would know that. So,
I think.
Well, I was going to ask, when I saw that list of names on the Palestine-Israel debate suggestions from Lex, so like on the Palestine side, you've got like Finkelstein, and on the right-wing side, on the Israel side, there's you, there's Benny Morris, but then there's also Ben Shapiro, and like I'm just wondering, like if there were the right combination of pro-Israel people, do you feel like you would feel more comfortable on the pro-Palestine side? Or
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I would never, because Lex was asking me for partners or whatever, and I was like, I'm not doing that debate with Ben Shapiro.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to end up siding probably with Finkelstein more. What were you were going to say something like?
Yeah, I think a lot of young people, particularly when it comes to young people getting radicalized and like really quickly radicalized about topics they don't know much about, I think a lot of it is social media specifically and how the algorithm works, on how it'll suck you into a rabbit hole where it'll show you exactly what you want to see, whatever. Make sure that you stay on the website so it keeps giving you that information. And people talk about things like the added context on Twitter, but those things get added like 2, 3, 4 days after the fact, after 90 to 95% of the people had already seen the post. And in these social media bubbles, not only can you get misinformed just due to the fact that, social media has lower journalistic standards of excellence than most published media, there's also the problem of course, being trapped in a rabbit hole where everybody around you agrees with you, and then you go in the real world or you see somebody who doesn't, and it makes you completely flip out. It's impossible for you to register or understand it.
How did your canvassing go?
I think in general my canvassing went well. Obviously there's a lot of doors that you knock that nobody's home, but when you do find the people that are there, it's nice to hear them when they're like, yeah, like I voted, or yeah, I'm registered to vote. It's like, hell yeah. A lot of them said that, actually, it was quite interesting. A lot of them said that their number one issue that they cared about most was democracy, funny enough. So I was surprised to hear that.
Is that where you learned that? Were you canvassing
People
together?
care about democracy?
Yeah.
Unironically, yeah, it was kind of cringe. I said it to a couple people. I was like, that's really cringe. You should have seen this one dude. I knocked on the door, and he came out. He was a young guy. Brown, can I say that? Yeah, and he opens the door.
Yeah, you can say that.
And I'm like, oh, wow, hey, how's it going? And he's like, very, very young. Okay, this guy's like mid-20s. And I'm like, hey, are you all registered to vote? He's like, absolutely. Me and my whole household are. And I'm like, oh, cool. What's the most important issue for you guys that you guys are voting on? And he looks at me and he's like, let me tell you about Operation Cast Lead. And I was like, oh my God. I had my Scars of War, Wounds of Peace book with me and everything. I threw my backpack on the ground. I must have been fist fighting for like 20 minutes before Aaron finally pulled me off and went to the next house. It was crazy.
In my experience, I got Trump and I got local issues. And the local issue for me was parking when engaging with people. So I think a lot of times when you do this canvassing, you might be surprised because politics is local.
Oh, also, unironically, something I heard a lot, which I'm glad, is abortion. I think
Because that was a recent issue in Ohio with the vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, true.
And had the Republicans got their way with the change in the actual, wouldn't have a supermajority, 60% plus, had they got their way with that, then that bill wouldn't have passed, because it only passed by 57%.
Well, isn't it wild that, the British can vote to do Brexit and tank their economy, and everybody can see they're obviously about to go into an iceberg, but they don't turn the other way. But then when people vote to, maybe give a woman the right to choose, you got to do everything to avoid the will of the people to stop
Well, the best argument against orthodox Marxism was always that material conditions actually doesn't matter that much to most people. It was a really common talking point in the Brexit campaign for people to say, like, yeah, if this means our GDP gets a couple of percentage points lower, I don't care. we'll have our freedom.
Seems like people
nationalism
care
is so
now, it
much
seems
more.
like.
Yeah, but not, yeah, again, like nationalism. If you ask Brexit voters if you regret your decision, they will absolutely say no.
A lot of them do.
So-
it's like
yeah, a lot of-
67% of the British population now believe Brexit was a mistake.
Do they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, why? Can you do anything by referendum in the UK? Could you like vote to abolish
You could
the
technically
NHS?
do it by
Or
referendum.
vote to make
Yeah.
like airplanes illegal? That's just so weird that you could do such a major policy decision by referendum.
Yeah.
How much
Isn't that very
misinformation was
democratic,
spread
though,
about the
or-
NHS and how much more money they would get.
I think the referendum just has to get approval from the House of Commons. I think they have to agree to have the referendum, and then you just have it. Yeah.
Oh.
So yeah, you could.
House of Commons 51%, or is it?
I don't know. It might be a supermajority, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was 51, because that's how parties pass legislation
That's so
in the UK.
dumb.
Well, you know,
The helicopter's here.
we're a democracy with Democrats, so
Yeah. Well,
Helicopter time.
that's at least that.
thank you guys for talking to me and having me on. I'll see you later. Keep canvassing.
Thanks for coming.
Phone bank with Progressive Victory.